Good morning, church. So, first of all, for those that are visiting both in person and online, I am not the guy, and I've never been the guy and likely will never be the guy. The guy is Bryce Kittinger, and I can't tell you, for those of you that are here, obviously you know how special he and Whitney and Judah and Isla are to this congregation, but also I want to tell our visitors that when you have the opportunity to hear someone who is so good at what he does and is so good at relating that to who we are and how we are to live, I really recommend you to come back and see him. We're going to be, several of us over the next few weeks, talking about stories in the Bible that maybe we've thought about and not really dug into very much. And hopefully this morning's lesson will actually shed some new light on a story that I think we all know and we've all looked at from one perspective or another, but maybe we have a chance to look at this a little bit differently. So I appreciate the scripture reading, and I could see people through the back of my head, their eyes wondering, why did he read that? What was the point of that? And before we get started, I want to set the stage for where we are, where Paul is and is now going, and all of the people that are with him, going before him, obviously serving in other places as Paul is on his journey back to Jerusalem. A journey that he is bringing gifts for the poor in Jerusalem. And the churches that many of which he has helped establish, are providing for those people in Jerusalem who are in need. So, all of those names, and thank you so much for trying to pronounce them. I'm not going to. All of the you'll note that Kelly was in the church bulletin this morning, is supposedly reading this. I think she chickened out, but that's okay. The reason why I wanted that read was we're all a part of a missionary journey, regardless of who we are and what we do. Put that a little bit more in perspective. The book of Acts was written by Luke. Luke, a companion of Paul. Luke, a physician. And Paul, and what is being written about the spreading of the gospel, an amazing evangelist, and yet Paul's vocation was that of a tent maker. What in the world does that have to do with Eutychus? Well, let's look at it a little bit deeper. If we reread Acts 1 through 6, there's a couple of things I want to bring to your attention. When the uproar had ended, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, said goodbye and set out for Macedonia. He traveled through that area, speaking many words of encouragement to the people, and finally arrived in Greece, where he stayed 3 months. Because the Jews made a plot against him, just as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to go back through Macedonia. He was accompanied by Sopater, son of Pyrrhus from Berea, Aristarchus and Secundus from Thessalonica, Gaius from Derbe, Timothy also, and Tychicus and Trophimus. And if any of you are looking for children's names, I highly recommend this passage. These men went on ahead and waited for us at Troas, but we sailed from Philippi after the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and 5 days later joined the others at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. So why did I emphasize us and we and join the others? I emphasize that because I want you to see that Luke is with him in this journey. It's not just something he's writing about. Luke is with him in this journey, and that's going to come into play a little bit later. So, Paul being on his third missionary journey, now leaving Ephesus, making his way to Jerusalem, following the end of the riot. Craig actually preached on this a while back. That riot was caused by the idol silversmith Demetrius, who was afraid that Paul's work was going to impact their business of making idols. Obviously, that was the truth. And in this case, after the riot was over, Paul starts making his way back to Jerusalem. So, as we move into Acts 27, it says, on the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, kept on talking until midnight. So if you back up one verse, it says they got to Troas, where they were staying 7 days. And so they're about to leave as they continue the journey back to Jerusalem. So a couple of things just in that verse. On the first day of the week. So I believe in my research that this is the first time in Acts where it talks about the meeting of the people, the church, on the first day of the week. As the Jewish synagogue meeting took place the day before on the Sabbath. I think that's important for a couple of reasons. Jesus was resurrected on the first day of the week. Not only that, Pentecost occurred on the first day of the week. So as these new Christians were meeting, they chose to meet on the first day of the week in honor of what it was they were there to do, one of which was to break bread, which in this case is the taking of the Lord's Supper. And since Paul was about to leave, he spoke a long time. So, first day of the week, not the Sabbath. First day of the week was a work day. So, all of these people that are coming to this meeting likely have worked all day long. They're coming to celebrate the Lord's Supper, to partake in it, and obviously to hear Paul, and in this case, Paul for the last time, which he knew was the case. Obviously, they did not. So when you look at Paul speaking a long time, it's not from the perspective of he just wanted to talk a lot. It was from the perspective of here these people are, hungry to hear more about the gospel. Having worked all day, now going into this home at night and on the third floor in a small room, listening to Paul as intently as they possibly could, as they were hungering to hear God's word. So, that brings us to verses 8 and 9. If you look at verse 8, it states, "There were many lamps in the upstairs room where we were meeting. Seated in a window was a young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul talked on and on." I need to pause there for a second because I think Bryce will probably listen to this at some point. That has never happened to any of you as he was speaking. So let's affirm Bryce that that's never happened to any of us as he was speaking. So Paul was talking on, and he kept on talking until midnight because he was leaving the next day. So let's unpack a little bit around those two verses. Again, we talked about it being the first day of the week, not the Sabbath, which means it was a work day. They met in the evening because of that, so that all believers, and I think sometimes we forget this, so that all believers, Jew and Gentile, free and slave, could attend, because that would be the only way that the entire group of believers could come together. It says in verse 7 that they met to take the Lord's Supper, something that we do every first day of the week here in our service. And obviously, if you go back earlier in Luke, as well as in Acts 2, it talks about doing this continuously, doing it and remembering what Jesus has done for us and God in sending his Son. So they met to take the Lord's Supper, but also remember this is the evening, and most of them, likely all of them, had not even eaten yet. They met in an upstairs room, and as we'll see in verse 9, on the third floor, in a small room of what was likely a believer's home. And so here we are in a small room, torches being lit because it's dark. And what happens when you have a small space confined with that type of lighting? Obviously, oxygen becomes an issue for some. And so here we have Eutychus. So he's likely worked all day long. He's likely a servant, and he's likely somewhere around 14 years of age. So as we think about that, also Eutychus translates in Greek to fortunate. We're going to see a little bit about that in a second. But in a bit of pulpit humor that Bryce and I have talked about, I think it could also be translated as Eutychus too if you fell out a window. So, Eutychus, you'll never forget the name. Here he is on the third floor, sitting in a window, trying to stay awake, trying to breathe, trying to listen intently. And it reminds all of us, how many times in our life do we have situations where we're doing our best to pay attention? We know it's important, but because of work, because of lack of sleep, because of other things going on, it just seems like our mind sometimes drifts away, and in some cases, we fall asleep, which is what happened here with Eutychus. So I'm convinced that my God has an amazing sense of humor. Because if he didn't, I couldn't tell you all the stories that have happened in my life that proves that. When Bryce sent out the list of folks that he wanted us to consider in a sermon scenario, I chose Eutychus immediately. And some of you that have been in life group with Laura and I have heard this story because it fits my life. So let's go back. I'm 16 years old. We grew up in a little small church called Chapel Hill, where if we got to 80 people, it was a big deal. I was the song leader of this congregation and had been even through the years of my voice changing, which you can only imagine how humorous that was. I'm 16, I'm sitting on the front pew. We have gone to this point in the service, and as a 16-year-old sometimes does, I had stayed out late the night before. No telling what I had been doing, but let's suffice it to say that I was tired. And so, as I sat on the front pew of that church, that small church, every Sunday morning, the Jameson family sat on the pew behind me. And it was Mrs. Jameson and her husband, their grown daughter, their daughter who was still a year or so younger than me, and the remainder of their family. And so just as we sometimes sit in the same pews every Sunday morning, we did as well. So this Sunday morning, I'm sitting there as Brother Garner. We were a small church. He was a retired preacher from Glenwood. He would come over a couple of weeks out of the month and preach for us. Brother Garner was preaching the word, and I'm sure it was invigorating. But unfortunately, as I was sitting there, I fell asleep. So Mrs. Jameson, the kind lady that she is, sitting behind me, saw that I had fallen asleep and knew that was not a good thing, and that I probably needed to be awake when it came time to lead the invitation song. So she very quietly reached up, tapped me on the shoulder. I sprung out of my seat, turned around, started leading the invitation song. Get through the first stanza of leading the invitation song when I recognized, first of all, no one else is standing, and number two, no one else is singing. And I stop, and I kind of look over my shoulder, and there was Brother Garner. And he looked down at me, and he said, "Jay, do you mind if I finish?" So, as Eutychus fell out of the window that night, and obviously fell dead, as we're going to read in just a second, if looks could kill, that day, my father shot me dead. I fell out of windows, off of tall buildings. He was not a happy camper, and in fact, after the services, his only words to me were, "Son, if you can't stay awake in church on Sunday morning, I can ensure where you will be on Saturday night." So, here we are in a scenario where Eutychus had worked all day. He's in a room that's probably difficult to breathe, that's stuffy with all of the people, and is in a scenario where he moves to a window, probably to try to stay awake with getting some fresh air. And as we turn to, again, starting with verse 9, seated in a window was a young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul talked on and on. When he was sound asleep, he fell to the ground from the third story and was picked up dead. Paul went down there, threw himself on the young man, and put his arms around him, saying, "Don't be alarmed, he's alive." Then he went upstairs again, broke bread and ate, and after talking until daylight left, the people took the young man home alive and were greatly comforted. And if you look at the greatly comforted, it is from a translational perspective, greatly encouraged for not only what Paul had said, but also what Paul had done. So let's unpack that a little bit. Here we have Paul preaching late into the night, people hungry to hear the gospel. This young man sitting in a window, falling 3 stories out of it, and hits the ground and is dead, as it states in verse 9. And who goes to Eutychus first? It's Paul, which I've always found really interesting, because who else is in this room? a doctor. His name is Luke. So God is amazing in ways that we can't even imagine. But one of the most amazing parts of this story to me is not that Eutychus fell out of the window, was dead, and Paul miraculously resurrects him. It was the fact that there was a doctor in the room when this happens. And it was God who uses a tent maker to bring Eutychus back to life and not a physician. And I think that has a lot of relevance with us. Because this story, interesting as it is, and as a part of Paul's third missionary journey, I think reaches out to each one of us and says, you know, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how you were trained. What matters is how God can use you in situations and circumstances that you would have never expected to happen. And when you look at God using ordinary people like you and me, let's bring this story to today. Paul ran down, threw himself upon the young man, and resurrected him. How many times every day do we, ordinary people, not trained in being the preacher, not trained in being the doctor of law or the doctor of medicine, not trained in anything other than, as was mentioned during communion, we're here to serve God. How many times do we have the opportunity to speak life into someone else? Life into someone who will, unfortunately, maybe I should say, not receive life unless they hear that word, the gospel, the story of Jesus from us. So, as we look at what Paul did and we read what Luke tells us, I think to me, the amazing part of this story is not the miracle in and of itself. The amazing part of this story tells me, as an ordinary person, that I too can speak life through the way I live, through how I act, through how I work, and through whom I'm able to talk about Jesus. And if we do that, then we too are speaking life. So, as you think about Eutychus, and you forget about the pun that I gave, Bryce and I laughed tremendously about. Think about how in your life, in your daily walk, whether it's at the grocery store, whether it's at work, whether it's just a stranger pumping gas, that the words you say and the way you act and what leads you, what gives you purpose, we have the same opportunity as Paul did that day in bringing life to others. If you're not a Christian and you would like to receive this life that's eternal, we would humbly ask that you make that decision today. That without Him, you have no life. This life is just a prelude for what he has planned for us going forward. We want everyone to be there with us. So if you haven't chosen Christ, please do so today as we stand and sing.